right. Everything is clear as mud now. So we do have some questions regarding tourism. So, Director McMahon, which ones would you particularly like to highlight?
Well, I have one question from Director Pratt, who wanted to know how the SCRD's contribution to Sunshine Coast tourism was affected by the advent of the tax, the accommodation tax. And I have a broader question, which was, I was under the impression that Sunshine Coast Tourism was taking over the visitor centers, so I was wondering why we have separate items for the Pender Harbor Visitor Center and the Gibsons Visitor Center, whether that should now be under Sunshine Coast Tourism.
Okay, well, thank you for those questions. Does staff have any information on that, or should we?
Yeah, so thank you, Chair. So staff have provided several reports regarding the MRDT and how that has impacted the Sunshine Coast tourism. So we'd be happy to reproduce those for the committee. The second part of that particular question, I think, would have to be addressed specifically to Sunshine Coast tourism because I think there are several differences as far as how that they have been operating the visitor centers. So I think they would have to report on that specifically as far as who they operate, because I know there's differences amongst the coast. So.
Okay, we have a question from the
so
audience.
I would pass the motion.
Okay.
Yeah.
The executive director is on his way here. He didn't realize it was going to be moving so fast, so he should be here in just a couple minutes.
Right.
Also on the board of tourism.
Right.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. So at this point, we're not really receiving any delegation at this particular time, so it wouldn't be appropriate to have that answered currently. So I think because we haven't given the other community groups the same opportunity.
Right.
So appreciate the suggestion from the community member, but most certainly through a motion, and we can coordinate so that can be presented during round one.
Okay. So Director Toth?
I just have one comment because we're talking about this in Seashelt as well a little bit. The visitor information kiosk at the top of the bypass, for example, is run by the Chamber, the Gibsons and Area Chamber, in separate from Sunshine Coast Tourism that runs the downtown visitor information center. I suspect some of these may have contracts or agreements that may be in place that may run a particular length of time. It may be eventually that they all do transition under Sunshine Coast Tourism, but that may not be a all-at-once thing.
Director Lee?
I can comment on the visitor information booth in Madeira, the main one there. There has been some discussions about consolidating, but it's not a simple task because the building is owned by the community that they're in, and so there has to be further discussions before anything like that happens. We can ask more questions of when they present, but there is a logic behind it similar to what we were just discussing. So there is good reasons why it hasn't happened yet.
Okay, Director McMahon?
Exactly. I'd just like to have a better understanding of what the current situation is and what the plans are in the long term going forward and what the timelines are on that.
Okay. My question to staff is, do we need to make a motion to see those tax, the tax information that you were going to provide?
Yeah, I think that there's two parts to that. So the first part would be a motion regarding that staff provide information to the committee regarding past reports on the MRDT, impacts of MRDT as it relates to Sunshine Coast Tourism. So I think that would be a separate motion. And then I would suggest that the second part be directed Sunshine Coast Tourism provide information regarding visitor information centers on the Sunshine Coast. So that would be two separate motions.
Okay, so as to the first motion, Tara, do you have one there?
Thank you, Chair Ties.
That staff report to round one budget with the history of the MRDT.
Okay, can I get somebody to move that one? Second? Director Hills, okay. And all those in favor? Okay. And then the second one, regarding the visitor center. Do you have something prepared there? Director McMahon, you have a question?
Yeah, I just wanted to add to the proposed motion that we also know the long-term strategy for the visitor centers.
Visitor centers,
yeah.
okay. All right, so we're looking for current funding and transition, and then also the long-term strategy as to what the desires are there. Do you have yep?
Thank you, Chair Ties. That the Sunshine Coast Tourism provide information regarding the current situation, the plan for the long-term strategy, and the timelines in regards to visitor centers transitions on the Sunshine Coast.
Does that sound good to you, Director McMahon? Okay. And it's coming into round one. Yeah, so. All right, can we move that one? Seconded by Director Julius. All those in favor? All right, excellent. Okay. Any more questions regarding tour? Yeah, number 14 through 17 that we so hastily. Yes, Director McMahon.
I'd just like to make the comment that the Coast Cultural Alliance provides just one of the best bangs for the buck on the Sunshine Coast in terms of their activities and the immensely successful arts crawl.
That is a really good initiative. Yes, Director Toth.
Actually, to add on to that, I'd like to compliment them for managing to keep their requests the same year after year after year.
Mm-hmm. Okay. We've got 10 after 11. Let's move on to item number 4. We're going to go back to staff to talk about the Seashell Public Library funding and service agreement options.
Yes, thank you, Chair. So in front of you here in your agenda on page 213 is a staff report just outlining a little bit about the current situation as it relates to the Seashell Public Library agreement. So there has been a lot of dialogue and correspondence with the library that's not included in this particular report, so I just wanted an opportunity to provide a little bit of that background and maybe why it's not included in the report. Of note, in February of 2017, the Seashell Public Library had sent a letter to the SERD board requesting that we start negotiations for the agreement early. So there were several meetings between the multiple parties with staff, with the library staff as well. And so consequently, a request came to the various organizations during the 2018 budget deliberations through pre-budget and through budget, and the SCRD board at that particular time chose not to do anything for 2018, but to essentially run the funding and the agreement out to 2018. So therefore, here we are. The agreement, we then had a transition of staff, so as soon as that staff was in place, then we essentially started to revisit the renegotiation of the agreement. So the agreement does state that the negotiations should start in July, but there was a little bit of timing difference from holidays, etc. So we started meeting with the staff in August and September. And so here we are, November 30th, and so we do have an agreement that's coming to an end. It's important to understand that historically, the service agreement ending, I think, does not mean that the board, the SCRD, has to stop contributions. So I think that's one of the items that the library board and staff are concerned of is whether or not library funding would continue. So that's one of the recommendations in the report, is to continue on with funding, because that would be consistent with all our other funders. We understand that there are running programs that are dependent on cash flow, and so we typically do continue to operate or provide cash flow, and then once the new request for funding is provided, we reconcile that as part of the back-end cash management process, if I may. So in front of you, or included in this particular agenda, is the Sechelt Library's request to the SCRD and the other funders, and essentially it's a little over a 12% increase over the 2018 funding, and that's really to give them a lift, and then they have some asks for the further 4 years, which are about in line with CPI currently, which is about ranging between 2.7 and 3% currently, so it's not too unreasonable. So the process here at the regional district is that because there's multiple funders even within the regional district, we have 3 parties even within the regional district, Area A, Area B, and Area D as part of this particular agreement, that it just makes this particular, I don't know if negotiation is the particular way, but I think that because we have multiple streams and jurisdictions that direct us, it's very difficult to, because there's not, the person in charge of this agreement, if I could say, would be the library, really. And so historically, you know, the regional district sometimes has played the part of the initiator, but I think that that's part of the challenge as we move ahead is I think we're coming into a good rhythm now where the library really is taking a very good lead on negotiating this type of stuff with the other jurisdictions. So that's, I think, kudos to them. It's very well organized, very good information, and it's worked well. This particular agreement has worked really well, I think, from the regional district's perspective, from a payment perspective, from a streamlining processes, because each year the library would come for independent requests, so there was no surety for them year after year. So staff most certainly recommend continuing with a long-term funding agreement with the library. So if this would be an opportunity that if the SCRD funders wanted any more information or make some recommendations that we were talking about earlier as far as funding allocations, etc., we most certainly have in the report some historical funding, that what would the funding look like if you continued status quo. So on page 214 of the agenda, it would just say that, you know, for example, Area A would increase to $33,519 if we kept the same funding mechanism. So those are kind of the options, is we can keep status quo, we can explore other options, but those are kind of the current scenarios at the moment. And again, we haven't heard anything back from our partners. So from the District of Sechelt, I'm not certain. I haven't heard back. I did reach out to the staff, but I haven't had any response. I have had a response regarding the Sechelt Nation, and most certainly what their concerns are in regards to programs that were agreed to be funded through the agreement, which are in Schedule A outlined, that are currently not being funded in the same manner. So I think that was some of their concerns. But I think some of these types of things are connected with the staffing requests that they have. So it is a little bit of a conundrum as far as that program. So, you know, part of the regional district's ask would help support that particular initiative as well. So we haven't commented on that specifically, but I did want to highlight it.
Thank you, staff. At this point, I guess we'll open up for comments and questions. Director Toth.
Thank you, Chair. I have some notes here from Director Seegers, who's not able to be with us today. One of the things that she wanted to point out is that a increase is required going into 2019 of that 12.5% to maintain 2008 service levels. The union contract is currently at the point of ratification, and so there's almost $19,000 over the 2018 costs, and that's retroactive to July 1st. The youth librarian position was vacated in May of 2018, and due to budget constraints was not filled. That position is required to be filled as per the funding agreement, and I know that that's a point of note from the Seashell Nation. And then there are on-call staff requirements. The costs haven't particularly reflected that. There is obviously an agreement that needs to be negotiated for the next 5 years. How that goes forward, there's whatever. Yeah, I'm going to leave it there. I have more to talk about after other people speak.
Okay, thank you, Director Toth. Anybody else? Ms. McMahon, Director McMahon. There we go.
Well, I also certainly support a 5-year agreement, having watched the festivities here in previous years when the library had no such agreement. I just wanted to check again, on this service agreement, is this a matter that the entire board votes on, or is it only the participants in the agreement?
Staff?
It would be depending on what you're voting on and when you're voting on it. So essentially, the types of things you would be voting on would be committing the organization, so the independent service levels, so it would be all. If this, in the context of the financial plan, that would be all participants. So most certainly it's to the discretion of the area, the specific area, what amount they pay towards that particular agreement. So again, on page 214, if there's any, if there is a request for more information, that might be based on a participant. So again, if it's just Area D requesting more information, then again, that would probably be all, because it's really just an administration type of thing. So.
Okay, Director Lee, you had a comment?
Yes, I have 3 comments, actually. First off, we need to keep the doors open. So that part, I agree. We need to figure out how to do that. And at the same service level, at least for the immediate term, until we can figure out where we're going. I note that the original agreement didn't achieve the results that it said it was going to, and I'd like to know why not. 6% per year is a pretty hefty increase. So there's something didn't work out according to plan. I'd like to know what went wrong there. And I suspect that the third thing is I need to know more about libraries and their evolution. I suspect that it's probably some new services that we didn't anticipate that's causing the fact that we can't close the gap. But I don't know that. I don't know enough about libraries. So before anybody, before I'd like to commit to anything, I'd like to have those ones understood however we can. So that's my comments.
Okay, Director Toth?
I can speak a little bit to it, and I know for sure we can ask staff to bring a report forward, but the initial intention of the 5-year agreement was to close the gap to the provincial average per capita funding for libraries of our size. Over the course of the agreement, that gap has widened because other communities have increased funding to their libraries faster than we have at the rate that was fixed in our agreement. Cost-wise, I know that they have software licensing, they've got program management, they've got IT. None of the capital is included in their 5-year plan. So if they've got servers that fail, if they've got computers that need to be replaced, Those are all things that are on top of the 5-year agreement, on top of the funding built into the 5-year agreement. Yeah, and in addition, there was just the new union negotiations that finished and the agreement that's being ratified. So there are a number of factors there, but for sure, we can ask staff if they want to bring back a report or part of the delegation.
Director McMahon?
Yeah, I think my question is a process question. What is the best way forward here? Would it be better to have a meeting with everybody, involved, just to discuss how to go forward, or what is the recommended way to proceed here? It is a pretty complicated situation with a lot of background.
Okay. I'd like to weigh in with a couple of comments before. Maybe staff might have a recommendation as to how we might want to proceed forward. I personally, the library does make a good sound argument that they do need to increase their funding, and I'd like to support them in the hiring of a youth librarian and all that. But to me, the big question is that how does Area D help with the funding, and so I would like to see some kind of a round table debate as to how we might actually allocate this funding and how it would all work out in a fair way, as we generally do a 50-50 thing between Gibson's and Sechelt, and if Sechelt wants more than Gibson's, then how will we make it fair across the board? And so, I'd like to see some kind of I don't know if we need several proposals that on how this funding might work, or maybe we just need to have a big roundtable discussion on all that and figure out what some of the other variables are, whether it's increasing the library funding for Gibson's, but then decreasing the port funding that the Area D covers for the ports, or it gets nasty at some point, but or crazy, but there's I don't know what kind of options there may be, but you don't want to go there. It doesn't look like it. But maybe staff has some thoughts on that.
I think from a process perspective, there was a lot mentioned there. So again, I know historically we used to have meetings prior to the service agreement where the library associations, both of them, would come and present to the board. However, but they're really not legal meetings. So I'm going to be honest. So hence why we tried to move to something that was appropriate in the context of moving decisions forward. So if it's an information sharing and knowledge gathering, that's a different kind of situation. There's I think a desire to get more of the historical information in respect to these various libraries. But again, understanding that because there is so much history, that it's difficult. So I think some of the things that are also kind of mentioned is also understanding what you can fund and what you can't fund. So staff can provide that information. For example, Director Toth mentioned capital funding. The current library services of the regional district are to provide operational funding for the varied library services. So if they wanted to construct a new library or do something of capital nature, your current bylaws do not allow you to fund that. So that would be a procedural change. That would require a bylaw amendment. So we would have to tell you how you would do that if you would want to contemplate that. So I think it really does go back to Director Lee's comment, which is understanding some of the historical information There's also been some comments of understanding why we didn't raise to parity, so maybe some of the things that Director Toth mentioned, but again, I think that's for the library to produce, not for staff to produce, because it would be secondhand information. We'd have to go to them, and so it's probably best firsthand from the director, from the Library Association. So how we do this, staff can kind of contemplate. If it's an information sharing and not a decision making, then maybe we could do something less formal. But again, we always have to be cognizant that if we have quorum and we're moving decisions along or making decisions, for the Local Government Act, we cannot. That's more of a challenge. So we would have to be very careful on how we do that. So again, that's why we always steer towards having informations come to committees like this. However, if there's more of a knowledge sharing, then maybe we could do something a little less formal.
So I'm just, thank you. I'm just going to jump in, and there was a question around how to sort of possibly move forward. So I'm going to steer back to page 213. And there are a series of recommendations there. And the staff have been directed to continue to have more discussions and work through that process. So this recommendation is reinforcing what our direction staff already have and would like to continue. And in addition to that, we would recommend that another motion, a recommendation be considered that we bring forward more information that relates to some of those historical context types of discussion items that the committee has had, and that we can do that in the new year for sure. Those would be some of the steps to at least start to have this discussion.
Okay, Director McMahon.
I don't think there's anything preventing the libraries from inviting stakeholders to have a discussion either. I do think that the Gibson's Library should be included if this is potentially having an impact on the funding situation with Roberts Creek. But
Staff?
Thank you. So again, staff are going to be just cautionary here. If you are invited to a meeting and you have quorum, it is an illegal meeting by nature of enough of the directors being in the room and furthering the business of the regional district. Those are the two benchmarks, if you will, the number and furthering the business and making decisions, discussing it. So just cautionary note. If there are other mechanisms that staff can explore, if, again, looking to have information sharing that we can do to ensure that you're having a legally convened meeting.
All right, Director Toth.
Looking at page 213 then, from a procedure standpoint, are we then looking at inserting a recommendation somewhere between the first and the fourth one, asking staff to come back with a report on historical fund operations and funding for the region's libraries?
I think we would recommend it be an additional. Yeah.
Okay. So looking at those 4 recommendations and then the additional one, are we okay to move towards those?
That's a separate motion.
There's
these 4?
No, these 4 and then
right,
and then the separate motion for that one. Okay. Right. I was going to go through them one by one, but that was okay. I guess we can move all those 4 and then we have I'd like to move that the report titled Sechelt Public Library Funding and Service Agreement Options be received, and that staff be authorized to meet with the Sechelt Public Library District of Sechelt and Sechelt Indian Government District to discuss options as determined by the committee, and that a draft funding service agreement be brought to a future committee for consideration, and further that the SCRD continue to provide its funding shared to the library as set out in the payment terms of the prior agreement and based on the 2018 allocations until such time the future agreement can be reached. Can I get somebody to move that? Second, and all those in favor? Okay. And then we have a separate motion that we would like some more information regarding the history of the Seashelt, well, the whole library system, I believe, and that we would like to have some discussion around that. Is there a wording that's more appropriate than that, Tara? Question by Director Toth.
Is that a report that should be coming to another one of these committee meetings, right? Thank you.
As the recording secretary, thank you, Chair Ties, that the staff report to a future committee regarding the historical context of the Seashell Public Library funding and service.
Should we expand that to all the public library funding, not just the Seashell Public Library? Director Lee?
I understand that there was some reports made that helped address this in past years. Would those be included in brought forward in this motion for our review again for an educational? Sorry.
Yeah, well, I guess we'll leave that up to staff, but staff, any comments?
Yes, staff will endeavor to provide as much history as we can regarding, but again, understanding that this is huge. And so we'll try to synthesize it as best as we can. But I think what we'd like to better understand is to provide history on the libraries is very generic. If you could specify what type of information you'd like, if you would like information regarding how funding allocations have been determined, how services have evolved. I'm not trying to create work for myself to give you these suggestions, but you know, if you want information regarding the legislative, so the bylaws, for instance, so what you can fund and what you can't. So I think we need some more specific direction on what type of historical information you would like, because whether it be for the Seashell Library, whether it be for the reading rooms, again, for the Gibson's Library, it would be a completely different information. So each one has their own story. It really depends on what story you want us to write.
Okay. So I heard funding allocations, I heard bylaws. Is there any critical ones I've missed there, Director Lee?
I understand there was a study done at, previously on cost of individual things like transactions, number of users. It was a study requested prior to the agreement being made. Are you familiar with any of that? Okay, I'd have to do more research then to know exactly what I'm talking about. Sorry.
Okay. One question that I probably should have asked earlier, but that I haven't asked yet, was Director Toth mentioned that that IT expenditures didn't seem to be part of the agreement, and that seems to me like that should be something that should be included in the next agreement. Yeah.
Again, I think that comes back to the bylaws relating around capital funding allowances and the funding agreements with the functions don't allow for capital funding, if that's my understanding.
Right. I guess in some respect, IT is, at least in my opinion, should be almost an operational cost, because by the time a 5-year agreement is done, you need a whole new set of IT. So it shouldn't really be a capital expenditure, but I know that's up to the accountants to figure that one out. Staff?
So again, if you want us to provide information on how capital funding could be addressed through the funding agreement, then most certainly please direct us to provide you with that information.
Okay, so that goes back to the bylaw issue then, and how the bylaws work. So, Director McMahon?
I'm wondering if we shouldn't take a 5-minute break to figure out what we're doing, just in terms of what kind of information that we want and what kind of a horizon, because we don't want the entire history of the library, so I'm thinking perhaps the last 10 years at the most would be more than sufficient.
Right. Well, I'm just wondering if we need to take a break, or isn't that what we're doing right now? We're figuring it out, right? Yeah, Director Julius?
I think that we just need to move staff's recommendations, and they're going to come out with a report. If you read their recommendations, the report will be brought out, and then once that is brought out and we all review it and we read it, and then we start hashing things out after that report has been provided to us. But my thoughts are, we've been on this too long now. Let's move it and move forward.
Okay. All right. I think staff was just requesting that we narrow the scope a little bit, but what we could do is just leave it up to the discretion of staff to actually narrow the scope on their at their discretion. Is that Director Lee?
I would think from a high-level view of the information we have is that this agreement was reached in January of 2014. There must have been some material provided at that time that allowed the decision to be made. So if we were going to go back in history, I don't think we should go much further than that to get the staff.
Director Toth?
If we're just talking about the Seashell Public Library. But if the information is broader than that, I would suggest that we, as per Director McMahon's suggestion, we look at a 10-year window of the funding allocations, the bylaws around the functions, and the capital capability within those functions, and that's the scope of our report that we ask for from staff.
Okay. Does that sound good to everybody? Director Hiltz?
It sounds like a lot. Yeah, I got concerns about the capacity of staff to produce this stuff, and I'm kind of looking at, we have a good report in front of us with some good solid recommendations. And to know why staff has got here in the past, I guess I'm relying on staff's expertise to some degree. I am curious about the apportion, but I'm kind of following with Director Julius, is that we have a good recommendation, and I'm not sure how much more information we need to kind of move the process forward here. So,
okay. Director McMahon?
I have actually volunteered to do a lunch and learn with the board on the history of library funding on the coast. I'm happy to do that to fill in some of the gaps. It won't get into every little detail, but we really don't want to get into every little detail.
Okay. All right. So does that mean we don't want to add a motion at this point? Yeah, we do. Okay. And so, Director Julius? Well, what is the motion? Well, we've already moved those. Staff, was there a motion?
I think staff had recorded a further motion that provided the scope, which we can bring back the information.
Okay. Staff, Secretary, do you have a further motion there?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Unfortunately, I'm a little bit confused as to what if you were amending an emotion, or if you're originally with the motion that I had read out and had been moved originally, which was future committee regarding the historical context of the Seashell Library funding and service. There was discussion, but I wasn't sure if that was formally amending the agreement, the recommendation.
Director Lee?
The discussion was actually on the urban funding, but somehow it got to the greater funding of District of Seashell and District of Gibson's and a fair share of funding. So I'm not sure what we're talking about here. Yeah, so I need a little bit of more understanding on what we're talking about. My original comments were based on are we doing what's effectively a user pay at this point? I understood the original funding was to a catch-up, and then we were going to start talking about ongoing funding from there. But the catch-up didn't work, so now are we talking about ongoing funding forevermore kind of thing? And I don't know how the original funding was made, the funding decision, because I understand that the original funding, there was a discussion around whether you funded by taxes and it was by assessed value, property value. I don't know the logic for the existing funding. I'm more of a user pay. In other words, if I pay $276, if Area A paid $276 per book loaned, then so should everybody else. And I don't know the answer to those questions. I want to pay my share, but I don't know what my share is. And that's a problem for me. I don't know what everybody else feels about it and how the whole thing works. That's my problem.
Okay, so I think if we ask for historical context on funding allocations and possible bylaw implications, that should hopefully answer Director Lee's question. And there was some whispering going on here. Secretary, do you have any more, or staff there?
Chair Tice, can we just have a 2-minute break just so that we're doing things procedurally? That's really what
Okay.
Yeah.
So let's have a 2-minute break, and thank you for being so patient, everybody. Thank you for your patience, everybody, as we're all in the learning process here, especially myself. So, having gotten some ideas from the staff, I think we're going to address the motion that is on the table at this point in time. If the Secretary would like to read that out one more time, please.
Thank you, Chair Ties. Recommended that staff report to a future committee regarding the historical context of the Seashell Public Library funding and service.
Okay, should we just move that? Seconded? And all those in favor? All right. We've missed Director Julius here. Does that mean that the vote is null and void, or is it? Okay, we're good. All right. That leaves us to communications. Item number 5, Annex C. I'd like to make a motion to receive those communications. Okay, seconded, and all those in favor? Okay. Do we have any discussion regarding that? All right. No new business. that leaves us to adjournment. I make a motion to adjourn. Seconded. Okay. And all those in favor? Thank you, everybody.